So it's time now to finally hand over to the lovely Stephanie Nebbia, who's going to lead the final workshop of this current term.
Hello everybody, it's really lovely to be with you. Thank you very much, Jen, for that introduction. I'm Stephanie Nebbia, I'm a painter. My main focus is on landscape and how we inhabit space and we relate to space. And so today what I want to do is show you some of the starting points I use and how I explore the macro, micro aspects to be found in landscape, and to take you through some ways in which to research colour and texture. And these are just some of the examples that we'll be looking at today. So they're very different, and I just really want to reinforce the fact that what you do today should be different from one another's and from mine, so that you're really finding your own vocabulary and really examining what your palette can do. And on that note, regarding the palette, I'm going to be using today just 3 colours: red, yellow and blue. And it's a really, really good opportunity to just find out a little bit about what your palette can offer, because there's lots of different reds, lots of different blues. So don't be concerned about whether or not your reds, yellows and blues are the same as mine, because it really doesn't matter. It's more a question of finding out what they can do and getting that kind of comfortable place with your materials so that you can feel really confident in experimenting. So I've just got red, yellow and blue. I've got some water. I've got some brushes, and I have also got some salt and a candle and some soap. And I've been very fortunate to be given these beautiful watercolours from Winsor & Newton to use, but you can, when you're experimenting, use food colouring, which is a really expensive way to experiment. It's not light, fast or permanent, but does give you the freedom and the confidence to play around with colour and texture. So I'm just going to put these to one side for a moment and just show you what I mean when I talk about getting acquainted with your palette. So I am just going to put one of my brushes in the water, and I'm just going to start with the blue and show you what I mean about having a look at what the colour can do. So here I've just added some water and a little bit to the colour. I will be, as I progress in the workshop, using some masked paper. I've done this so that the stages are clearer to you, and you may want to do this too, but ordinarily it's not necessarily something I do when I go on to make studies. But if you do, now's a very good time to do it, while I just talk to you about different ways in which you can explore what your palette can do. So I'm just adding a bit of water now so that I've got a very wet surface, and I'm now going to add some more colour to see how it moves around. This is quite a nice way of looking at the contrast of working on a dry surface to a wet surface, because what it does is it shows you how the colour can move. When you're using watercolour paint like these pigments in Winsor & Newton, the size of the pigments and the speed at which they move really, really differs. And then I want to just sort of play around with different marks to see what I can do with my colour and if it's got any sort of dramatic, stronger tones. And now I'm going to do the same with my red. I'm just going to see what kind of red it is, whether it's got a strong, darker tone, because sometimes the colours have a real contrast between the dark and the light, which can be quite interesting and something to play on when you're deciding whether to add more water or use a heavier loaded brush or not. Now I'm going to wet the surface of the paper with a much cleaner brush this time, and I'm just going to drop my red in there and watch it really kind of move around and see how strong it is as a colour on the surface. And this is a great thing to do whenever you get any new colours or anything that makes a colour, is that, you know, it really does sort of give you a chance to find out, you know, about any new additions to your palette. And it reminds me a bit of sort of doing scales in music, that you have an idea of, you know, what its potential is, but also as a chance to kind of warm up and start exploring your own vocabulary. And it's amazing how quickly the yellow moves compared to the other colours. It really sped across the surface, which I find quite exciting. And you know then that you're going to get quite different marks just by changing the nature of the surface of the paper that you're working on. So here we have our basic primary colours, our blue, red and our yellow. And we already can see different textures. Now, what interests me about texture, I can often find from some of my resources that I use as my starting points. If I just move that to one side, I use lots of different starting points. I take a lot of photographs which are downloadable from the website that you will have been sent a link to. And these are all photographs I've taken of different landscapes that I find really interesting in terms of colour and texture, and also in terms of the light. And I do a lot of observational studies. I use watercolour and pastels, or I use mixed media as I have here. So I do a lot of observational drawing. So I get different kinds of primary resources that I use to inform the colours that I like to explore. I like all the greys that I was looking at when I sat and studied and made these observations. And I really enjoyed the greys in this particular image. So these are going to be some of the things that I'm going to use as a starting point in today's session. So I'm just going to put those to one side, having already the basics of what our palette do. And I'm just going to move, my screen isn't showing, oh, there it is. I'm just going to reacquaint us with the fact that we're using these three colours, and we're going to start looking at some of these starting points. So I'm going to use this image, I think, to begin with. The reason being is that I like certain aspects of it. Now, this is quite a handy device, actually. It's just 2 bits of card, and you can certainly just use your fingers as well. And it comes from Viewfinder. Constable's an artist, along with Turner, who's really inspired work that I make and my interest in landscape. And you can see how it can really sort of capture just bits of images. So not being too concerned about painting whole landscapes, but just looking at elements of it. And I use this same device when I'm out doing drawings and studies in the landscape, so that I can really focus and not get distracted by other areas of the subject matter. So I'm going to take my first bit of paper that I prepared, and I mentioned to you earlier that I've done this in order to be able to show you more clearly each of the separate stages. This isn't something you need or have to do, but by all means feel free to if you wish to. So I am now going to use my reds, yellows and blues to start mixing secondary colour. So I'm going to take my red, and I just want to wiggle it across from side to side. And this way you get a really nice even wash, and it really avoids streaking. And I want to add some yellow to the top and do the same. My brush isn't too clean, but I'm not too concerned about that, because the whole purpose of this little study here is to look at how you can create other colours just by mixing them together. And so I'm going to add a bit more yellow to that red, and already we can start to see lots of different tones of oranges. So already we've got some really beautiful combinations of oranges mixing together to create this nice secondary tone. So I'm going to do the same over here, but this time I'm going to use the red across the middle here and wiggle it down, and I'm then going to add the blue to see what kind of violets I'll get when I mix it with the red. Now, of course, you're going to get lots of different violets depending on your combinations of blues and reds. And that I always find really, really interesting, is that, you know, each blue, each red, each tiny little variation offers you a new possibility. So use this as a chance to sort of really find out, you know, the colours that you have available to you, what they can do. Because then this just adds to the vocabulary that you can then apply later. So we've got some nice things happening when the colour's really bleeding and moving around. And of course you can sort of tease it a little bit more to control it if you want, or just enjoy allowing it to move around, because these textures are being created by the paint and the surface of the paper. And then
we've had a question come through from Barbara, and Barbara would like to know the paintbrushes that you're using, Stephanie, what number are they in terms of the size that those paintbrushes are? Can we just go through those?
Absolutely. So this brush, I always favour a large brush, I must say. This is called a one stroke, and it's a synthetic sable brush. This is a 1/2 inch or 13 mil. And then the other brush that I'm going to use will be a size 6. So it's kind of what I had to hand. And
Brilliant.
then the quantity of paint for anyone is 5 mil. And because it's watercolour and it's Winsor & Newton, so it's highly pigmented, a little bit goes a very long way.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And can we just, in terms of the exercises that you're doing at the moment, are there any of your kind of reference images that you would say kind of are inspiring the proportion of colours that you might be doing at the moment that people can refer to on their end as well?
Yeah, I mean, at this stage, I'm just examining the secondary colours that can be created from these primaries. And then what I'm going to do is start looking at those and then referring back to some of the images that we were looking at just a moment ago. So the sort of the deep, warm foreground in this image, I'm starting to look at this lovely, deep, sort of warm area here, and then this lovely sort of subtle mauve that's occurring. And already I'm starting to think about the relationships between the tone and the light and the subtle palette that can be achieved. So what I'm hoping is that as we go through these stages, we will start to look at, if you remember when I showed you at the beginning, I'm going to look at how we can develop some of these colours to create very sort of different possible outcomes, where you've got some that will be more subtle than others. It's really a preference what you want to achieve, if you like bright colour or if you like subtle gradations. There isn't a right or wrong way of doing this. This is an opportunity to really experiment and see what the possibilities are. So on that note, I'm going to now look at my next secondary comparison, and I'm going to take the blue and I'm going to use it in the top, wiggling from side to side to sort of disperse the colour. And this time I'm going to take the yellow, and you can see how it bleeds really beautifully into that blue, and you start to see these wonderful greens. So already I'm enjoying the natural texture of the pigment, and I'm also enjoying these lovely tones that are being achieved and created where the colours are mixing. So before I start looking even more at creating other textures, to go back to the point that you just made, Jen, be a really good opportunity to sort of look at the relationships of the colours, because then I've got more information when I start to experiment with creating textures responding to the landscapes. So what I want to do now is look at these secondary colours that have been created, the orange, the violet and the green, and I want to start looking at complementary colours and relationships. So what I'm going to do now is start to make some pairs of contrast, because already if we think back to this image here, you've got this kind of orangish dark foreground, and then you've got this lovely sort of grey blue sky, and that's a natural complementary, because what you have is you have your red and your yellow and your blue, which are your primary colours, which have made orange, violet and yellow. So when you want to create a complementary colour and you want to take yellow, for example, so if I just take yellow, hopefully a bit cleaner than the bit on my palette where I've managed to put my blue brush in. The complementary colour to yellow is violet, because violet is made from blue and red. So if I add some red, and if I take my blue, which are violet, really nice subtle violet here, it's quite blue, so I'm going to add a little bit more red. There we go. And if I mix that, or I can leave a line if I don't want to mix it and I just want to observe the contrast, the only colour that's not in that secondary, which is blue and red, is yellow. Therefore, it's complementary. So you've got three colours, and you find the complementary by matching it with the colour that's not present. So in violet, we have blue and we have red, and the only primary that's not present in violet is yellow. But I'm actually now going to mix them together. And what happens is quite magical, because you get this really beautiful grey. And the nice thing about mixing greys by using the three primary colours is that each grey you mix with your different complementaries provides you with a different grey. So I'm going to do it again, and this time I'm going to use orange. So, and the complementary colour to orange, therefore, will be blue, because blue is the only colour from the primary three, red, yellow and blue, that's not present in orange. So there's my beautiful orange in the foreground, and I'm thinking back to this image here, which when you can see it firsthand and printed it out, a nice orangey, deep brownish orange, which is not dissimilar to the kind of subtle orange I've got here. I might add a tiny bit more yellow. And now I'm going to really try and keep my brush clean, just to show you the contrast. And now I'm going to add my blue, which is the only primary colour not present in the orange. And then as I start to blend them together, you get this lovely, lovely grey tone emerging. So already you're getting these really lovely strips and blocks of light colour and tone. And then finally, I'm going to use the red, and it's complementary. So I've used a very small amount of colour there, partly because my palette is now running out and will need replenishing. But also, if I want to think about sort of really soft, sort of subtle skies, then it's a really nice way of being quite gentle in the amount of colour that you use. If you want to bring out, for example, in one of the images that I shared with you on the resource, softer, pinker skies, you can see the pink on the mountains there. So it's a really nice way of, you know, being gradual in building up colour. You might obviously want to add more colour later on, but you don't have to commit to that straight away. So now I'm going to make my complementary to red, which is green, because red is the only colour not present in green, which is made first with some yellow here and then adding the blue to it. Got really lovely green there. And I already kind of quite like the shapes and the distance and things that's occurring, but I also want to find out what kind of grey it's going to make. So I'm going to sacrifice that really nice shape that's occurring and add a bit more red to that green, because it was very subtle. And you can see here you've got three very, very different greys, and I'm kind of really enjoying how the colour's starting to move around and create its own textures. So I'm going to leave that to dry. So I'm going to start by playing around with some textures and using some of the information that we have from the colour mixing. So I found out, you know, what my palette can do, the different kinds of greys and things that I can achieve. And I'm going to start with using a wax. And if we go back to, it's a great one if you're doing textures of things like mountains, or if you want to do sort of textures on the beach, or rock faces, but in this instance, I just want to start looking just at lines and simple shapes and horizons. So I'm going to use my wax candle quite heavily in the center there, and then I'm just going to make it quite subtle and not press so heavily, just to see what the texture does when I start to apply the color. And I'm going to start with using a blue, and I'm going to put quite a strong color at the top, and I'm going to allow the color to really feed down. And you can see already the resist from the wax. So you've got really nice strong horizon. I really like what's happening with the strength of the color and how it's moving around at the top. And here I want to start playing around with something a little more subtle. So I'm going to add the orange and try and get that nice sort of warmish tone that we achieved earlier by mixing the orange with the blue. So if I just add a bit of the yellow and red to my foreground, I'm really enjoying the different tones and the subtlety that I was enjoying when looking at some of these images, for example. In terms of, I've just seen that message, in terms of the watercolor sitting on the wax, it will resist, so it will eventually sort of evaporate. It won't stay on there. You can use, if you enjoy this technique, you can use more archival conservation mediums like masking fluids. You can get permanent masking fluid, which is like a liquid wax, which means that you can have a little bit more versatility. You can also use masking fluids that you can remove, Winsor & Newton make all of them, if this is a technique you like. So this is a really good way of finding out. So that's using the wax, and you can use it in a number of different ways, and you can certainly use it in terms of creating contrast. So if I want to do another one just below, and I'm just going to really use it quite lightly everywhere in this foreground here, and I'm going to use a different combination of colors. I'm just going to add some yellow, and you can see it's more subtle, the texture. So where I've gone for something that's really strong here, I've gone for something much softer and less contrasting, but quite interesting. And then if I add some blue again, but this time maybe a less, so I get a completely different result and atmosphere. And I'm going to take it all the way down to my yellow, so that you end up with quite a nice sense of space. And the nice thing about this is you can leave all of these things to dry. Absolutely everything we've done you can leave to dry and rework into that, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a while. But for now, I just want to show you another interesting texture and technique, and this time I'm going to use a violet that I'm going to mix on the surface with the red. It's really nice and dramatic, and take it all the way down. And I'm going to use the salt in this one. Now I've got a mixture of salt here, and it doesn't matter if you've got only one kind or more than one kind. You can use it and sprinkle it quite finely so it's not too close. But in the foreground here, thinking about all those sort of rocks and beaches and things with lots of texture in the foreground, I'm going to put quite a bit. And then in the sky, I might actually just put a few bits and sort of see what the contrasts are as they occur. I'm just going to leave that to dry for a bit and then do another one. And I'm going to, again, like I did before, use something a little bit more subtle in the sky here, and I'm now going to make a little bit of an orange, as I did before, as a nice complementary. So I'm going to add some yellow to that red. It's still a little bit red, So I'm just going to add a bit more yellow. So what you can do is really sort of read the colour and sort of add to it. You can pre-mix the colours onto the palette if you want to, and then you'll end up with a more solid unified colour. Or I do enjoy getting the combination of tones that can be achieved by allowing the colours to mix on the surface. And now I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit of the salt just in this foreground. And you can use things like a granulation medium if you want to make a really, really sort of considered longer piece of work there, where the longevity and its light fastness is important to you. But for just finding out what these things can do, we've got such contrast here between each of the images, using wax more heavily here, much lighter here, using the salt and with a different combination of colours than we've used here. And then in my final set of images on here, I'm going to use soap. So I'm just using the end of a bit of soap, usually the bit that's actually quite difficult to wash your hands with. And it's a good tip to know that if you do end up using masking fluid because you really like the resist so much, and you want to protect areas of your watercolour later on in later works, protecting your brush beforehand with soap by doing this stops any masking fluid ruining the fibres of your brush. But what I'm doing is I'm using this as a texture medium, and it means that I'm going to go back to my colour now, having really created a lather with my brush, and I'm going to take a bit of the red, and you can see you have really nice definition with the soap and the brush strokes, which you don't get with watercolour when you're not adding anything to sort of alter its body and viscosity. Now I'm going to add a little bit more soap, and I'm going to add some yellow to that red, because I want to show you how you can really layer the textures and the marks. It gets a bit dry because it's a really hot day today, which is why I think my phone didn't like it very much. You'll find that if your paint dries, just keep adding a little bit of water, but you can see you're getting some really nice textures here, and it means that you can really start to sort of play around with defining different textures when you're adding body to your paint. The other thing is, when you've got texture medium like this, you can sgraffito into it. So it's quite a nice thing to do when you're using watercolour, because obviously the texture is created usually by the paper and the way in which you apply sort of layers and washes of paint. So this is adding a real sort of body to your paint. So because I've got these hints of orange there, I'm going to add again a sort of light blue in the sky, and I'm going to show you how it really changes the nature of the marks you can create with your blue. So if I think about the textures that can be, so I've put just a normal strip of blue watercolour there, and now I'm adding a little bit of soap and water and less colour, and we've got some really nice movement in the sky there. And I'm going to now do the same thing using that same palette and using the opportunity to mix some of the grey. So I'm going to start with the blue again. I'm going to add a bit of water because I'm in a really hot room. I hope you're nice and cool from wherever you are. And I'm just going to add this blue and this texture all the way across. Now I've added more colour, and also I hope that on the screen you can see really strong definition of the retention of the brush strokes. So that's what texture medium will do, is it will really add texture to your mark making. So I'm now going to take my orange and make some greys with use of the soap. It's quite green. And add some really nice sort of grayer tones to my study. Now that's still quite blue, so I'm going to add some more red and yellow. And don't worry if it isn't quite doing what you hoped it would do. You can work back into these, and I'll demonstrate that in a moment. So if we just look at some of the textures and things, and of course you can sgraffito, try and make the marks that come towards you larger so you get a really nice sense of space. And of course you can start to sort of really redefine the horizons and things if you want to. Now, how you approach it each time can be very, very different. And I just want to remind you, while you're experimenting with your own tests, with some examples that I made earlier, just to sort of talk you through the different possibilities. So you can see I've got my violet with my yellow here, and I've used a tiny bit of wax, and here I've used a much heavier wax layer, and I've got a very soft red in the sky there, and I've mixed a very blue-green as its complementary contrast. And then over here, I've allowed the colour to sort of move around a lot more, and my marks in the foreground, so that I've really started to sort of think about, you know, some of the nice textures that can be found in some of the images of mountains and things, and the sky, and the different approaches to creating surface. And in this one, where you can see that I've really kind of mixed sort of the yellow into its grey, then into its violet, and then introduced the salt to really add to that texture, in contrast to that lovely sort of bleed between the two colours. And then I've done the same here. I've done exactly the same exercise, but using far heavier salt and a much lower horizon to get a completely different effect and result. And if you leave your salt to dry, this is really important that you leave the salt to dry so that you can really get the definition. And these are nice and dry now, so I can just pick off the salt and on this as well. And then of course you get a really, really strong definition, almost as if the salt was still on there. And here you can see I've got an orange, really soft orange sky, complementary to the blue, using the wax in the mountain sort of definition here. So there are so many different ways in which you can approach it. You can use very subtle palettes like this, and while you're carrying on with your studies, I just want to remind you of some other examples that I've done, so you can see where I'm just using primary and secondary colour using the soap, and where I've used secondary colour and it's complementary using the wax, and where I've used primary colour mixing the secondary in the foreground using soap, but using it in quite a sort of strong definition. And here I've used salt and mixing primary into secondary colour, so you're getting all these nice oranges, but on a wet surface. And I've done the same, working on a wet surface here with my primary colour, making my secondaries. And then here I've used complementary green with the red using the salt. And I've got another complementary here where we've got the salt on the orange with its nice contrast to the blue. And you see a nice little bit of bleed started to happen here with the violet. And then the same here where I worked on a wet surface. So when I mentioned earlier about, you know, you can leave these to dry and then you can work back into them, I just want to show you what I mean, so that later on you feel comfortable with working back into your composition, so that you can create a little bit more definition, bring a bit of control back into them while they're doing their thing. And as you can see, these have become quite explosive, and I'm just going to put these to one side to dry just a bit longer, and then show you a really simple series that I did with just the blue and the orange as complementaries, using the soap and the salt and the wax. And now I'm going to paint back into these, and it's nice because it means it really gives you the opportunity to add more. And also, if you want to lift watercolour, the great thing about it is that you can lift colour if you want to move it around a bit more and you feel that, you know, it's not doing what you want it to do. So I'm just adding water here, and what I would like to do is add a tiny bit more orange and some more water in the foreground, just to make the foreground a little bit more distinct. And I'm just going to add a little bit of salt here, because I'm going to think back to one of my earlier images and these textures that can be found in the foreground. I'm just going to add. So you can use the salt not just in the first layers, but also when you're working back into them in the second layers. And in this one here, I'm going to work back into it with a little bit of the wax. So I'm just going to put a very light layer of wax, and then I'm going to sort of lift the colour a bit. I don't want it quite as grey as that, so I'm just going to put a bit of a wash with the yellow that's not completely clean, which is not going to bother me too much, but I'm just now going to add a yellow layer over that wax that's almost protected the sort of orange, slightly grey orange underneath where the blues come into contact with it, because they're complementary. You get these lovely greys. And then if I lift that yellow into that blue, I get a really nice kind of green horizon there. The other thing I'm going to do while it's wet is I'm going to sgraffito into it. Now, I know I mentioned sgraffitoing into the soap, but actually if you do it on the wet surface of your watercolour, what happens is that the paint starts to collect in the indentations that you've made. And as it dries, that becomes more apparent, but not too unsubtle. It's not like drawing the line into it. It's just like adding a tone of marks, if you like. So I'm just going to leave that there to sit, and you can see already I'm getting some really nice textures occurring in the foreground here, which is a bit reminiscent of some of the images that I was looking at. So I think back to this beautiful image here, and when I was looking at sort of particular strips of colour, but I also really enjoy the lines in the foreground. And of course you can start to create a little bit of texture and indentation if you want to in the foreground, and create these subtle marks and textures on the surface of your paper, whilst at the same time really enjoying the surface of your paper. Now in the next one, I'm going to add some soap into the texture of that orange there, and I'm just going to create a lather and add some more orange in that foreground, so that the strongest contrasts come towards you. So what happens is the grey recedes into the background, cooler, greyer things go off into the distance, and then the warmer, stronger things come in the foreground. Now, it's not quite subtle enough, so I'm going to add a little bit more soap and less colour. So I've got the mark making and the texture, and then just allow that to move back. And then I want to add stronger contrast and colour in the foreground, so with the soap. So you've got very, very different results using the same palette combinations, where you've got the blue with different kinds of oranges. So it shows you how three colours can create so many different tonal ranges and possibilities, and how something like soap can be applied in layers, but also in isolation to create all sorts of images, but also combining them. So I'm going to add a little bit more definition here in this study, where I've used soap in the foreground, and I sgraffito into it to add more contrast, to really make it come forwards. And here you can see where I've added the salt has really granulated the colour. So now I'm going to add a little bit of weight and texture using the soap on with the blue, just to give a little bit more heat to the colour just at the top there, but also a bit more texture, so it feels like the skies are really coming towards you. And these are so many ways in which you can explore texture and colour, and you can keep working into them more and more. And if I go back to the one that I started right at the beginning, where we were just looking at colour, and I can just start to take off some of the tape, so that you'll see sometimes the tape is really helpful, gives you sort of crisp edges. Sometimes it doesn't like the paper and it takes a bit of the paper with it, but I hope for the sake of this session today, it's just made it really clear and easy to see. When I tend to work on slightly larger scale, like I have here, I tend not to tape. I tend to just use a smaller piece of paper and work slightly larger. But just for the purpose of today's exercise, I thought it would be good for us to just have really clear images. Now, what you can see is where we've had the colour mixing and creating its own textures, I can start to really think about where I would like to add more texture and how I would like to maybe sort of redefine these compositions a little more. So I'm going to think about sort of adding more body and mark making to this sort of yellow here, because I really love the way the grey sits in the centre and really recedes, and then this beautiful violet, but I feel like the yellow is a little bit lost there. So I'm going to take my soap and I'm going to add some soap to my yellow, just to give a bit more texture and weight. And also you can see that because watercolour is transparent, the soap doesn't take away the transparency of the watercolour, or if you're using food colouring, and in a way creates a really nice glaze, which actually is a nice surprise to me. So I'm going to sort of play with that a little bit more, and I want my marks to actually sort of suggest something. So I want them to suggest the textures in the foreground, make the marks quite large, and also a contrast to these finer marks in the distance there. And I just want to sort of sharpen up that foreground just here, and I might even consider now adding a little bit of colour to warm up the yellow. So not to not make it yellow and turn it into an orange, but to make it a slightly warmer, slightly reddish yellow. So I'm going to add, so this is when you start to look at tertiary. So we've looked at primary colour, we've looked at secondary colour, we've looked at complementary colour, we've looked at mixing greys by mixing complementary colours together, and now by altering the primaries ever so slightly, we're looking at tertiary colour. So I really like the way the sort of warmth of this yellow now just shifts the space towards you. So I hope you can see that on the camera clearly. And of course you can keep working back into all of your studies in all sorts of different ways, and you may even decide that you prefer to just use one colour and look at texture. And what I mean by that, I just want to show you an example of how effective these textures can work just in isolation with one colour. So I've just used some wax here, some salt, and then some soap, and just each individual colour, and then started to look at blending other colours as well. But back to these pieces here, if I want to sort of look at making decisions about creating more definition and more texture, I'd quite like to add even more texture to that sky there. So I'm going to put a wash of blue back over the blue that's slightly dried. Everything's drying so quickly in my studio today because it's pretty hot in the summer and very cold in the winter, as many studios are. And now I'm going to sprinkle some salt and leave that to dry, so I've got even more texture. And then I'm going to actually sort of play around with creating a bit more of a gradation of tone and colour, and tease some of those edges of the paint. So it's quite nice. You can really get control over your mark making and rework into watercolour quite effectively, and kind of really enjoy having that dialogue with it, and how the paint moves around. And then I just want to go back into using the soap in this one at the end. I'm going to add a bit of yellow to that green and really enjoy some of the shapes that have been created just by the paint moving around. But you can see how it's really adding texture, but it's not killing the interesting marks that occurred beneath. And then I'm going to put a very gentle wax over the top, and then a very fine glaze over the red, just at the top there, not all the way down. I just wanted to just alter the light. So you can work into all of your images in all sorts of different ways. And I hope that this has given you an insight into experimenting with colour and texture, and just to sort of revisit some of the other examples that we've created, and have a look at how some of the others are drying. So I'm going to go back to this other piece. So the nice thing about working in this way, with just 3 colours, is you get really confident and very acquainted with your palette. When it's restricted, it's quite liberating. You feel a sense of freedom when you really feel sort of that you've got a lot of control over something, because it starts to feel very familiar, and you start to recognise, you know, what the potentials and limitations are of the colours that you're using. And so I find it really helpful to really explore and experiment with a colour, and to really use it as an opportunity to sort of play around with textures and different ways of working. And so do feel completely confident to allow the colour or the wet paper to inform what you're doing, and that there isn't a right way of doing something. There are so many different ways in which you can create compositions, explore textures, and really get to know your palette.
Stephanie, that has brought us really beautifully to kind of the end of today's session, and we've had so much wonderful feedback coming throughout. Barbara says this has been so interesting. It would be lovely if we could have a follow-up showing how to add natural elements such as trees, hills, mountains, etc. Really lovely idea, Barbara. Jack says you are an absolutely amazing teacher, Stephanie. You're so knowledgeable, and the whole process has been seamless. So that's a really big compliment to you, and we couldn't agree more here at Hospitoriums.
Really seamless bit after having a phone that looked like it was about to set fire to itself. It's really lovely. Thank you for saying that. It's really reassuring. I was really trying to keep my own cool then.
Absolutely. And Wheatfield Unit have said they've really enjoyed the session today. We've had people joining us from Lavender Ward. Big hi to all of you. Linda says this has been brilliant. Thank you. Lavender Ward have said again that the patients are loving the session today. Shelley says excellent, thank you, please do another. So Stephanie, I cannot express what a wonderful seamless workshop this has been, and I can't believe the sheer amount of effects that we'd be able to create using just some simple household materials, and three separate colors as well. So I'm just going to pop the camera there, and Stephanie's just showing you her pieces there. And just a note for everyone that your works are all going to look completely different to this. They might look similar effects, but that is not the point of Digital Art School. We really encourage you to hone in on your uniqueness, and we can't wait to see all the incredible works that you've created. So Stephanie, on that note today that we've drawn to the end of the workshop, we'd just like to say a really big thank you, but also, do you have anywhere online that we could look at more of your work, or any more tutorials, etc., or do you have any shows coming up?
Yeah, thank you for that, Jen. I have a show coming up in September, a solo show at the Turin Gallery in Folkestone. It's on for the whole of September. It'd be wonderful to see you there. I'll be there most weekends, certainly. I've got a piece in the Royal Academy this summer. It's quite high up, but you might be able to spot it. It's in the Grace and Perry room, and actually it's using one of my sort of architectural landscapes. So nice contrast to what we were doing today, whereas in September my show is focusing very much on colour. So I hope you'll be able to recognise these areas in which I sort of explore. And I have a website which is just undergoing work at the moment. I'm known on Instagram as Stephanie NP Artist Curator, because I'm also a curator as well as an artist, and I create opportunities for curation with artists. I work also with the hands-on art workshops with the refugees in Kakuma, so you can find me on there as well. So I hope you get a chance to have a look at some of those things, and look forward to working with you all again, I hope at some point.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Just a final little note, a complimentary note from me as well. Jack, who has joined us for the workshop today, has said, Stephanie, you are a really gifted teacher and artist, and we couldn't agree more. So thank you once again, Stephanie. I'd just like to take this opportunity to say a big hello to units that I know will be watching this back on demand. So big hi to Snowsfield Adolescent Unit, Ladywell Unit, Averset Ward and Fir Park School. Thank you again, Stephanie, on behalf of Hospital Rooms for such an incredible workshop today. And thank you so much to everyone that has joined us. We are really kind of battling with the sunshine today, and you could have all been outside, but you've chosen to stick indoors with us and grab your paints. So we're really grateful for that. And we can't wait to see what you've created in today's session. Thanks to everyone that submitted a comment. It's always really brilliant to have you with us live. So it's time now to launch our end of workshop poll. If you could please indicate on your screens how you found the workshop today with Stephanie. This will really help us to grow and improve the Digital Art School through 2022 and beyond. So this poll will be appearing on your screens now, and I'll let it run through to the end of the session. Thanks for your feedback, everyone. So for those of you that are still here with us, I'd really like to share the story of Hospital Rooms and how the workshop today has come about. So we are a London-based arts and mental health charity, and we transform inpatient NHS mental health units with extraordinary art. You might be a unit award that has worked with us in this capacity before. The Digital Art School is hugely important as it allows us to build a community where we can join together globally and feel part of something really special. You can find the library of all of our past projects and all of the previous workshops on our YouTube channel, and you'll find lots of different sessions from collage to drawing, printing and painting, and so many more. Please do have a look and subscribe there. We also have a Digital Art School newsletter, which will keep you informed of our upcoming workshops, the materials that you'll need for them, along with any PDF downloads that you'll need for the activity. So you can sign up for that at hospital-rooms.com. As we have expressed already lots today, we really love when you share your artworks with us by uploading them to our online gallery. You can submit those using your name, or you can stay anonymous. If you've created some paintings today, either joining us live or watching this back as a recording on demand, we'd really love to see them. So that's it for this term of Summer Studio. Thank you so much to everyone that has joined us for all of these brilliant creative workshops. We will be back in September for a brand new term of workshops focusing around the theme of sustainability. So keep your eyes peeled and do sign up to our mailing list to be the first to know when those will be coming up. So from myself and everyone on the Hospital Rooms team, thank you once again so much for joining us today, and another huge thank you to our brilliant artist, Stephanie Nebbia. See you all soon, everyone, and hope you all get to enjoy the sunshine. Take care.